What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Today, we are bringing to you, in today's podcast, we're bringing to you a subject that is very controversial in the medical field. It's very controversial in the people dealing with this. You yourself might be dealing with it. You might have a friend who's dealing with it. You might have a family member or a loved one who's dealing with this. Let's get straight into it. Today, we are flat out talking about, is addiction a disease? And as our little intro fades out here, we're going to kind of get straight into it. I'm going to bring a couple of neuroscientists into this equation. I'm going to give you my own personal view and what I believe are truths and untruths about addiction, my experience with addiction, why what I say is credible at all, because that means something. Lots of people talk about this subject and have zero experience in it at all. So we're going to get into that. And then I'm going to bring up some wording from some people who have done this for a living for the past 2.5, 3 decades. So, first of all, we're going to talk about my position. My personal position is that addiction is not a brain disease. And my position is that it is a word we use to describe a mental or physical dependency upon a substance or chemical or something. It's not always that. It can be cell phone use, it can be sex, it can be over computer usage, um, it can be anything. Um, drugs, it can be anything. So, my personal stance is that it is not a disease. My background with addiction is that I at one time was addicted to opiates. I loved them. I spent variations of opiates also. I used to do other drugs that had them involved also, like ecstasy, so on and so forth. But um, for the most part, in they were all drugs that were downer sedatives, stuff like that. But they all contained diamorphine, which is heroin. So the I was bad on it in my early 20s. I would spend every single penny that I made on them. If I didn't have money, I would steal from others to gain the money to be able to do that. It was always the lookout for how I was going to obtain the next fix, quote unquote. Um, so I didn't go through a rehab center. It eventually got to a point that my life, I was just like, something's got to change or I'm going to lose everything I love. So I put it down. Had a couple of cop scares in there a couple of times. I almost went to jail a few times over it. To make a long story short, I chose to put it down cold turkey. And the first month was pretty rough, and then after that things got better, and I've never thought about using such things ever again. So not only am I living proof of that, so my personal experience with addiction is firsthand, but my entire family's plagued with it. My mother's an ex-alcoholic, my brothers are ex-alcoholics. My entire family is plagued with addiction. So my mom, just to give you some background, was a drunk whenever I was a little kid. She went through a 12-step program. Upon completing said 12-step program, she went about 15 years without drinking a drop. It's pretty impressive. I don't know the exact amount of time. I think it was 15 years without drinking a single drop, and then she started drinking again. My mother's been drinking for about 10 years now ish. Not that long, but it's been quite a while. I believe it's been like 10 years. And since she started back drinking, has never shown one single sign of relapse in any way, shape, form, or fashion at all. And she has drank to the point that she's belligerent drunk. Now, that totally goes against the whole philosophy that addiction is a disease, because you believe you're plagued by this disease you're stuck with for the rest of your life. And if you ever contend with the substance that you were using at the time of your addiction, you will relapse and end up back being an addict again. So as you can tell, my mother is living proof that that's not true. She actually said something that relates to something else I'm going to get to, relating to that very thing that will resonate with me for the rest of my life. Both my brothers are or were addicts. They were alcoholics. Both of them have pretty much got a grasp on that. They drink socially now. One of them doesn't drink at all. I stand corrected on that. One of them has stopped altogether. One of them drinks casually. So, and I'm sure when I mean I can't speak for him. I don't know how headstrong he is in this department. So I don't know if he'll eventually start drinking again or what have you. He may decide to not do it ever again. Regardless, when my mother started drinking again, she said something to me after she started whenever we were talking about addiction that resonated with me, that will always resonate with me for the rest of my life. And what she said was is when I started drinking again, what I learned is that addiction is not actually a disease. See, she had gone all this time being taught it was. She was so scared to drink alcohol. She was so scared for alcohol to be in the same house as her because she was so fearful that if it was around her, she'd relapse and become an addict again. So she said, when I stopped drinking, what I learned is that addiction is not actually a disease. The addiction is a disease concept is simply a belief people have to believe to overcome the obstacle that's in front of them. It's what they have to believe to understand the power of addiction and to understand that they're stronger than the addiction. It's what they have to believe to get past it. Okay, now, of course, those aren't her exact words, but that's the motivation of what she said. That's the gist of it. So, the words have been interchanged through the years. I don't remember exactly word for word what it was, but basically, my mother said, addiction really isn't a disease, but most people that are going through recovery have to believe it is to overcome how strong of a hold it has on you, which is true. I do believe that. I do believe that there are people who have to tell themselves that addiction is a disease for them to overcome it. And with that, I have no quarrel at all. I have no issues with that whatsoever. What I would have a problem with is someone who is using the addiction as a disease clause to justify their behavior, because now we get into the part my position with diseases and why what I'm saying is even credible in the first place. Number one, my entire family has been plagued with addiction. Number two, I have an actual disease. I don't know if all of you listening know, but I have an autoimmune disease called bilateral autoimmune optic neuropathy. My immune system attacks my optic nerves. As a result, my optic nerve flares up, not allowing information to my brain, and I can't see. My vision over time will progressively get worse and worse, and I do stand the risk of going completely blind at any time during my life without any warning whatsoever. Every morning, I wake up and the first thing I do is I take immunosuppressants. I take steroids in hopes that I don't go completely blind. Who knows what's to come? Who knows when it will come? I don't know. I didn't ask for this. I didn't do anything that caused it. It just came and I'm stuck with it. So, as someone with an actual disease, there are times when people crutch on the idea that addiction is a disease that it really bothers me specifically, who's stuck with this thing I didn't ask for. I didn't pray for it. I didn't, sign a ticket. I didn't do anything to get this. I don't wish this on anyone. I don't wish addiction on anyone either, but you play stupid games, you get stupid prizes. But so anyway, that's my position on both. My family has been famined with addiction through or the entire last two generations. And the second part is I come at you as someone who has an actual disease. Okay, now with what my mother said, there's a doctor by the name of Dr. Carl Hart. If you're not aware of who Carl Hart is, I have been following Dr. Hart for quite a few years now. I've actually, in debates on addiction and substance abuse, I've actually used many of Carl's statements as an argumentative clause against people who do believe that addiction is a disease. Now I'm coming out and going to let you know where my sources are coming from. If you haven't looked into this dude, he's extremely knowledgeable on the subject. He has a PhD in neuroscience from Columbia University. This dude has literally beat every stereotype in the book. He's a successful black male from the ghetto and an ex-drug user, and now he's uh, a degreed neuroscientist in the field of brain study for addiction, drug abuse, and drug effects on the human brain. And he's also now the chair of the psychology department at Columbia University. And he's also the first African American ever to be tenured at Columbia University. This dude has broke the mold in so many ways, which is why, in my opinion, he's probably the most credible source on this subject. He's not an MD who's sharing his opinion. He's not some doctor working at a rehab center. He's not some doctor working at a methadone clinic. He's not some doctor working for a government granted, what you call it, minute clinic, like the health clinic that you go to. This guy's a legit neurosurgeon. Of course, he doesn't. When I say neurosurgeon, he has the capability to work on your brain. He just doesn't. His study is in how the chemicals and electrical movements work within your brain, corresponding directly to drug abuse and drug addiction. Like, this guy is the book on this. He's where people who want to know stuff. He's the guy who writes textbooks about stuff like this. So anyway. His stance on this says that some people think that the addiction as a disease narrative is more compassionate. He goes on to say that there's not much evidence to support the theory that addiction is a disease of the brain and it has done more harm than good. The clause, the idea or belief that addiction is a disease. He believes that it's done more harm than good. He said the problem is that if addiction arises from effects of drugs on the brain, there are two paths to a simple solution. Eliminate the drug from society via restrictive policies and law enforcement, or look for a fix within the brain itself. But then with those two solutions, there are several problems with the approaches. The first one is relying on law enforcement to remove drugs from communities has led to rampant discrimination. Viewing drug use as a chronic medical condition has not prevented drug use from being a criminal justice problem. In other words, lawmakers 100 years ago decided they were going to make all this stuff illegal in hopes that it would deter people from using them. Okay? And then it was also listed in the DSM-5, substance abuse disorder, or substance dependency disorder is what quote unquote addiction is listed as in a psychology book for a book of disorders and syndromes. That it's considered an actual medical condition, and neither of these things have gone on to reduce any amount of issues of people using this stuff at all. Has not deterred anyone, has not provided any solution whatsoever for the battle on this stuff. Roughly 20% of the people in our nation's prisons and jails are locked up for nonviolent drug offenses, and black Americans are significantly more likely than whites to be incarcerated for drug offenses despite equivalent or sometimes lower rates of drug use. I also relate the incarceration rate behind this to be socioeconomical based also. Rich people are also far less likely to be incarcerated for drug use than poor people are. And unfortunately, part of this racial part comes out of a socioeconomic stereotype. You have to look at the fact that in very low poverty-stricken areas with reduced income and high saturation of government housing, most people who live in those subsidiaries are not white. That's just unfortunate, but it's the truth. And if you live in those areas, you're more likely to be targeted by police, and if you have drugs on you, you're more likely to be arrested for them. If you're driving a car in that area, you're more likely to be searched. You know, if you're driving an 89 Honda Accord, you're more likely to be searched than someone driving a Porsche. So money and socioeconomic position has a lot to do with this. However, what he's saying is accurate. The second part, he goes on to say the drugs themselves are probably not to blame. Indeed, drugs have the same neurochemical effects on the brain of every single user, but only a small subset of people actually become addicted to those drugs. And despite decades of research with increasingly powerful brain imaging technology, there is still no scan that can discriminate between addicted and casual drug users, nor make predictions about who will go on to abuse drugs. There has been no identified biological substrate to differentiate non-addicted persons from addicted persons. So, if you take an addict and a non-addict and put them in a CT scan, aside from the adverse effects that person A's drug itself may have caused within the brain, you cannot determine which one is an addict and which one is not just by looking at the brain scan. You have to get a history from that person to know what they've done and what they've not done. There's no physical entity inside one's body that shows addiction. Addiction is not a physical presence inside your body, which is exactly why I conclude that there's no such thing as a disease called addiction. For those of you that don't know what a disease is, a disease, by definition, is an anomaly inside of your body that creates a disruption in your body's natural systems. Let me say that again. It is an anomaly inside of your body that creates a disturbance in your body's natural systems. Meaning, if addiction were truly a disease, even if it were a brain disease, and I'm going to go on to talk about other brain diseases, actual brain diseases. But if it were a brain disease, whenever you stop introducing the drug, those same adverse effects that were happening to your brain would continue to happen, and they do not. Once an addict stops using, those adverse reactions to the brain stop. So addiction is not a disease. Okay. Now, the next part I'm going to talk about, like I said, I'm going to get into actual brain diseases. How we can conclude that addiction is not a disease versus something like bipolar disorder or bipolar schizophrenia or schizophrenia is bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are degenerative brain diseases. If left untreated for extensive period of times, both of those degenerate your brain, specifically in the amygdala area and hippocampus. Okay, so both of those areas will reduce size over time as a direct result of these two brain diseases inside your body. Now, I can relate to this because with my disease, when I get a flare-up due to my immune system attacking my optic nerve, in an MRI scan, you can see my nerve swelling most of the time. Sometimes you can't, but most of the time you can. There are retinal scans of the back of my eyeball. I actually shared the Facebook one time that show where my optic nerve connects to my eyeball, and you can see the dark cloudedness around the really bad eye where the scarring is as a result of my disease. It's a physical presence within me. You can physically see it on a scan. It's there. Okay, that does not exist for addiction. So, the next thing we're going to go on to I'm going to break into the fact that I fully agree with Dr. Hart. I don't believe that addiction is a disease. I don't think that there's science that actually backs up the idea in the first place that addiction is a disease. So one of the videos we're going to get into, we're going to segue into that here in just a minute, is by another neuroscientist by the name of Mark Lewis. And how we're going to segue into this is the belief that, of course, drug or illicit drug use has negative and adverse effects on the brain. It can actually even deteriorate the brain. Addiction itself does not, but okay, even byproducts of being addicted can alter the brain because they're traumatizing. But one of the things he covers in this video we're about to watch is that's the amazing thing about the human brain is it's always changing anyway. Drug use or not drug use, traumatizing events can alter your brain chemistry. Um, Being struck down by a loved one can do that. A loss of a family member. All of these can have adverse physical effects on your brain. Therefore, none of those things are considered diseases. So addiction should not be considered a disease either. The secondly important thing as the segue into this video is labeling it as a disease does not actually proactively solve anything. In fact, labeling yourself as a disease-ridden kind of puts a sense of powerlessness on you and your involvement in this activity. So I personally kind of relate this to be on the same platform as a lot of people's position with systemic racism. And what I mean by that is I do honestly know, before we start another argument in a conversation that doesn't need to be had, I do honestly know that there is racial bias and there is profiling that happens according to specific race in America. That exists. I'm not arguing it. There are no systems in place that dictate that men of color or women of color are to be held down. Now, my point in saying that I compare the addiction is a disease clause with systemic racism is this. If you're taught that by nature, that by automatic presence, that you're flawed from the get-go and you have no opportunity to ever be to that naturally you have this gigantic obstacle that most people within your demographic are not going to overcome, you are far less likely to succeed than if you fully understand that it's not there to begin with and you just overcome it. Okay, so in systemic racism, the idea that you're flawed or that you're lesser because you're black hinders you as a black person. You're far less likely to get out of poverty because of that. You're just going to say, screw it. I'm just not even going to worry about this anyway. I'm being held down because of my skin color. So, and as you can see from Dr. Hart here, that's not always the case. The fight can be hard at some times, but you can definitely persevere through it. So, it's in the drug addiction community, it's the same thing. Whenever you say you have an addiction, whenever you say you have a disease that is addiction, you remove some of your personal accountability from having to deal with the adverse effects of your addiction. It's easy to dismiss to the public some of your responsibility in that result because of the fact you can just say, oh, well, I have a disease. I'm an addict. I'm going to have to live with this for the rest of my life. So some of your bad behavior can be blamed on that disease. And in my personal stance, addicts don't get that luxury. You just don't. It's not a disease. So anyway, the next thing we're going on to here, we're going to move straight and segue into the video by Mark Lewis. I want to mention again, I do not own this video. I'm just using it for educational purposes.
Neuroscientist Mark Lewis spends a lot of his time thinking about addiction. He's got good reason to. In his 20s, he struggled with his own addiction to opiates. He eventually managed to leave that behind him, but the experience has sparked a lifelong interest in the area and its links with neuroscience. Now a professor of developmental psychology at Radboud University in the Netherlands, Mark Lewis has written a new book. It's called The Biology of Desire: Why Addiction is Not a Disease. In it, he argues the prevailing disease model that sees addiction as a brain disease that renders addicts helpless to deal with it is seriously flawed. Mark Lewis joins us from California. Mark, welcome to RM Breakfast.
Hi there, thank you.
Mark, why is addiction not a disease? Because that's certainly what the medicos have been telling us now for a long time, and they reckon they've got the research about the brain to back it up.
Right. Yeah, it is definitely a prevalent model right now, this dominant model. And it's mainly based on the findings that there are brain changes that correspond with addiction. Things change, and those brain changes can last past the time when people get off drugs or other addictive activities. The thing is, though, that the brain is changing all the time, and it changes more thoroughly when there's more intensive learning experiences. So if you see addiction as an experience which is driven by intensely emotional learning experiences that are repeated over time, those brain changes are no longer surprising, and in fact they correspond with brain changes that occur when people fall in love and when go through other major life changes. So there's no reason to call it a disease. It's not very helpful, and it doesn't really add anything to the explanation.
So it's not a disease because you're not arguing with the medical science that says the brain changes, but you're just saying that that's not unique and doesn't equal disease. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah. I mean, these days, neuroplasticity is really an important area of research, and we see that the brain is massively changeable. It's always changing. It changes in response to physical problems, trauma, stroke, and so on and so forth. But it also changes with psychotherapy. It changes if you learn to drive a taxi cab in London. There's evidence that driving a cab in London makes your hippocampus about 20% more massive than that of other people, because you have to remember the names of all those streets.
You write in your book, you say, as you waded through a sea of papers on the neuroscience of addiction, you learned how circuits devoted to goal-seeking become captivated by the appeal of a single goal, a drug, a drink, gambling, porn, whatever it is, while simultaneously increasing its own appeal. And this is where you link to what you just said there. It's the same circuits that might be occupied and sort of, manically working if you're in love, for instance, and obsessively in love. So as you discuss that with the medical world, and show that those circuits are doing the same thing, therefore it doesn't equal addiction. What do they say to that interpretation of the data?
Yeah, it doesn't equal disease,
It doesn't equal disease, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, no one is saying that addiction is not serious, that it isn't destructive, and clearly it disrupts people's lives, and it can often really wreck lives. But the medicalization, the diseasing of addiction leads to, first of all, psychiatry kind of works in a colonial way. It takes over territory. And it says, well, okay, addiction is a disease, and therefore the way to treat it is by having medically based rehabs. And, of course, the development of certain drugs is really important, and addicts need to follow a medical regimen and do what they're told, basically. And the learning model of addiction is different. It says, no, actually, addicts need to have a more powerful sense of their own perspective. They need to develop effort and willpower and self-control. They need to be helped to hold on to different goals and to maintain their commitment to those goals. It's entirely different from a medical approach to the problem.
It is, but when you say, as you said earlier, that to treat it like a disease, to treat addiction like disease is not very helpful. I mean, as you also say in your book, we've started to separate our ideas about addiction from assumptions about moral failings and are less likely to dismiss addicts as simply indulgent, lacking in willpower. I mean, it is helpful to separate it from that, isn't it?
Well, it's helpful. The stigma of addiction is not particularly useful. Shame is a pretty intense negative emotion, and it probably makes people feel like doing more of the addictive activities rather than less. So I'm not saying that we need to sit back and be accusatory and blameful and moralistic about addiction, not at all. But I don't think you need to call it a disease in order not to denigrate people who have fallen prey to it. It's clearly a serious cyclical habit. It's a learning phenomenon that's difficult to break out of. Clearly addicts don't like being addicts. It's not much fun, and they need help. But I don't see why that means we have to ridicule them or stigmatize them just because we don't call it a disease. You've
done an enormous amount of research for this because, as you've written about your own experience with addiction in your memoir of an addicted brain, you've begun a blog on addiction. Many hundreds and hundreds of addicts and former addicts have contacted you.
Right.
What has that led you to conclude in terms of what is, if you don't want to, if we shouldn't class it as a disease, or it's not a disease, as you say, and that's not the best way to deal with it, to put it in that medical model, what is the best way?
Yeah, so my connection with people who are struggling with addictions or who have struggled with addictions makes me more and more aware of how ineffective the medical model has been. And the notion of having a disease, the notion of being a patient with an illness, even a chronic illness as it's defined, doesn't make people feel much better. In fact, it often makes them feel worse. And there's some evidence that the believing that addiction is a disease is itself a predictor of relapse. So it engenders a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness that is in itself works against the process of recovery. So what is it? Well, I think it's a learning phenomenon. I think it's a learned habit of mind, a learned habit of thought and emotion and activity. And it's the main thing about it, the reason why it's so insidious is because it's based on a recurrent set of activities. You do it again and again and again. Whether it's drugs, booze, gambling, sex addiction, or porn addiction, the high, so to speak, doesn't last very long. And so there's a recurrent phenomenon. And it's that cycle that continues to grow and modify and entrench neural pathways that hold the pattern in place. And the more you hold it in place, the more you do it. The more you do it, the more you reinforce that configuration of neural pathways. And so it's a funnel. It's a self-enclosing tube that becomes really difficult to break out of. I think that's what it is, and I think that the neuroscience and our practical understanding of addicts' plights converge on that sort of understanding of what addiction really is.
It's 8:24. Our guest is Mark Lewis. He's a neuroscientist. His new book is called The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease. So where does this take us, Mark? If that's the neuroscience, as you've explained it, and we need to try and break that habit, I guess, is the action, does that mean if we're taking it outside of the disease model, we're removing the value of medication, for instance, to help with addiction?
No, not entirely. In the book, I tell the stories of 5 addicts who I've interviewed in great depth, and I get into their biographies. And each one of them has gotten into addiction and gotten really trapped by it and then gotten out again. And most addicts do actually recover. And so the addicts that I talk about in the book, they've recovered in various ways. But for some of them, especially those who are addicted to physically addictive substances like opiates, like heroin, they often need medication in order to go through a withdrawal period or even a maintenance period as they're getting themselves together. So medication is important, but it's important as an adjunct to treatment. It shouldn't be, it's not the main, it's not the center stage of treatment. It's something that some people need and other people don't.
So treatment, just very briefly, the treatment, if you're taking it outside the sort of hospital disease model, treatment then rests with psychology, psychotherapy, that kind of treatment?
Yeah. Psychology, psychotherapy, group support, mindfulness, meditation, motivational interviewing. There's a whole bunch of psychological and related techniques and humanistic techniques and interpersonal techniques that can be very, very helpful. And the fact is, medication has not been very successful. I mean, you've got opiate substitution therapy, opiate substitution drugs like Suboxone, buprenorphine, which is like what methadone was prescribed for a little bit in the older days, still is. And they're not very helpful. They can get you from one addiction into another, but they don't actually deal with the source of the problem.
Okay. Mark Lewis, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Mark Lewis is a neuroscientist, and his new book is called The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease. It's released by Scribe today, and he'll be touring Australia in August, appearing at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas at the Sydney Opera House.
Okay, again, I want to recap the idea that Dr. Lewis talks about the maintenance period when recovering. So you're an addict, and then you overcome your addiction, and then you go into this recovery phase where using a drug that is a physical dependency, like such as heroin or pain pills or whatever it is that you've got, alcohol. Sometimes medications are required. 2 of the big ones are Suboxone and methadone. Now, I don't want to get too far into this because there's another video I've got in a grander clause that I want to get to at the end of this that actually tie both of the videos together based on things that they said. And to briefly get into that, I want to talk about the fact that they both have key interest to talk about how addiction should be treated and how we move forward from addiction in the future. They take a proactive approach toward that. But continuing on to the methadone part, I do believe things like I do think that there's a place for things like that, even though they're not majorly successful. Yes, there are people who get in clinics and see doctors for methadone treatments and Suboxone treatments, and ultimately they're just trading one addiction for another, which is true. That's a fact. So the narrative there is, I actually have a buddy who that's the route he took to get off an opioid addiction rather. And he was pretty he was pretty far gone. He lost almost everything that meant anything to him in his life. The only thing that stayed was his marriage. So every single other thing he had ever worked his butt off to achieve was gone because of his addiction toward opioids. And even the thing that held on got rocky at a few points, I'm sure, during that whole thing. It was probably not an easy ride. I can only imagine. This person I'm talking about went on to he went toward opiate substitution therapy, which is methadone clinics, and I can proudly say that this person, this member of he's not blood, but this member of my family, this very very close family friend of mine, is now both drug and methadone free. He's not using either anymore. And like I said, I know that there are people who do that try to stay within the system because it's basically a free way for them to get stoned. But this person I'm directly speaking about did it the right way. He persevered through it all, and he is not using either or now. So I can say in some cases it does work. So we're going to go ahead and segue into another video. This video really doesn't mention whether addiction is or isn't a disease. Now, I want to tell you, we've got two neuroscientists that deal directly with drug addiction and drug abuse on the human brain, telling you that the neuroscience behind the addiction is a disease fad is unrealistic. It's not there. There's no proof that it's actually a brain disease. So, and lots of people get this confusion that's just because it's listed in the DSM-5 as a disorder and syndrome that it's a disease. But what people have to realize is that not all disorders and syndromes are diseases. Sometimes a disorder or a syndrome can be a simple repetitive behavioral trait. So just because it's listed in a medical, a psychology brain science book does not classify it as a physical disease. So, okay. This next guy I'm going to show you. Ooh, well, I didn't mean to click that. This next guy I'm going to show you goes on to talk about addiction, what he believes causes addiction, the true rate in which he believes that addiction occurs. He then goes to talk about some very 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 cool statistics that we're going to get into after the video about some studies that a spin-off study in variation was done by Dr. Hart, and the reason I didn't mention that whenever we were talking about Dr. Hart was because of the fact that I didn't want to give away the details of this guy's statement while he's giving it. So we're going to watch it. I'm going to give you my take on the points he said. We're going to spin back and talk about Dr. Hart's study in the same manner. And then we're going to go and talk about the conclusion and how we're supposed to deal with this huge problem moving forward, or my opinion as to how I think relating to everyone else's conclusion in this, how we move forward with drug addiction. So here we go. I do not own anything by TED Talks. This is solely their property. I'm just using it for educational purposes.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you, for 20 days now, went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated. Actually, very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us. Maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might, after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately £1 gazillion that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulão to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it's fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down. HIV is massively down among addicts. Addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now, that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones or to shopping or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And yeah, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction. But weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it round. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I learned about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture, right? We've traded floor space for friends, we've traded stuff for connections, and the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And yet, Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and it's right to talk about that, but we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. But if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you're angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our life is typified by, I think, by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a pretty simple premise. You get an addict, all the people in their life, gather them together, and say, if you don't shape up, confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing of the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I'll come and sit with you because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that he talked about here. The first one is chemical hooks. Of course, I do believe that there is a small percentage of people who do become physically dependent on drugs that have physical dependency factors to them, such as pain pills, heroin, etc. Stuff like that you do become physically hooked on. As being someone with a disease that causes pain, there have been many moments I've been introduced into the hospital, and then arriving there, I receive my pain treatment. And then when I leave, I refuse the treatment, which I'm going to segue into another thing he brought up here in just a second because of this statement. upon leaving treatment, I always decline carried on treatment. So if like they offer me hydrocodone for 30 days afterwards, I always decline that. But when I get out for the next 4 days, I'm literally bedridden. I'm so sick. The withdrawal from the pain medicine I received for the few days I was in the hospital is so strong. It's like the worst flu I've ever experienced in my life. However, because there becomes a mode of accountability for that, and you have to take responsibility for what has happened. I chose to go to the hospital. I chose to receive that treatment. As a result, my body built a dependency on the medication that I was receiving. So I also have to bear the responsibility of going through the shit withdrawal I go through every time I get out of the hospital. I am literally in the bed for 3, 4 days every single time, fighting withdrawals from my pain medication. I don't wish that upon anyone. It's the most miserable thing I think I ever go through, ever. And it happens every time I get out. Now, this segues into two other things he addressed in that same topic. The first one is he picked out the middle row and he said if we took all of you guys and gave you heroin for 20, 30 days, you'd all come back addicts. While it's true that some wouldn't, some would. That would genuinely create some addicts. And he didn't address that, but that's a fact. Some of them would come back addicted to heroin. And the same thing, he had mentioned that his grandmother, who needs a hip replacement, she comes out and she's not a junkie. However, that is the cause for some people's addictions to medications and drugs. There are people who go into a doctor for a legit pain cause. They get in a terrible car accident and are put in a coma for a month and they're put on pain management. They get off and they're continued on pain management before they realize what the hell happened to them. They're hooked on opioids. There are people that happens to. There are people who become legitimate recreational drug abusers because of a legitimate physical reason they went in to get doctor's treatment for. That exists. It's a real thing. Now, the reason why I wanted to wait to discuss the last portion of this is we're going to go back to Dr. Hart. You heard the rat experiment that was done in the early 20th century, and you heard by Dr. Alexander the rat park idea that he created to reiterate this, and you also heard the statistics found by the Vietnam War. Well, Dr. Hart also did an in-person recreation of this exact experiment done in a controlled environment with actual people. He found drug addicts in the streets and people that were diagnosed with substance abuse disorder or substance dependency disorder and brought them in and offered them in a controlled environment over an extended period of time. He offered them their drug of choice or an attractive alternative. In Dr. Hart's study, that attractive alternative happened to be money. And what he found is in low increments, when it was $5 of the drug users tend to pick the money half the time and the drug half the time. But what he found later is as he increased the attractiveness of the alternative, that the whole demographic of that changed. When he increased the amount to $20, that number went down. When he increased it to $50, the addict never used the drug. They always took the money. So, this segues into my conclusion. Through Dr. Hart's experience, in his personal experiment he did, and through Dr. Lewis's statement about his belief that our issue with drug addiction pandemic is actually a disconnect issue, and then this last guy you just saw the video on saying that he believed that the opposite of being addicted is being connected. What I have found, what I think we should progress forward with this is stop alienating addicts. Yes, what they did is awful. Yes, it is a choice. Yes, it's a lifestyle position they chose to take and they reap the consequences from it. No, it is not a disease. Yes, they must take responsibility of it. They're also more prone to use more if they feel alienated and feel like they're a castaway. They're bonding with that physical euphoria because they feel like they don't have anything else. That's what leads to the physical dependency. So people that are pushed away, you're lingering your connection with them over the top of their head, are far more likely to continue to use and not become sober than people that have a constant support system, who have a job to get up and go to on a daily basis. These are all super important things to remember, and that's the way I think we progress forward successfully with drug addicts. Don't push them out of your life. Make sure that, just like that friend I was talking about that I dealt with, I was always here. I didn't approve of what he did, but I was always here for that friend no matter what. It didn't matter what he did or said to me. I was always here for them. I was always there. All they ever had to do was pick up the phone and make a phone call, and I would be there in 5 minutes. And that's the approach we have to make sure that no matter what, these addicts, these people that are stuck in this turmoil, understand that they're not alone, that there are things that they can do besides do that drug. There are people they can connect with. There are people the people and things they can bond with besides that euphoric feeling of getting high. So that's my position on it. You're more than welcome to leave your personal position in the comments, even if it opposes mine. I do want to mention again, we do have two neuroscientists here that say exactly the same exact way I feel on the matter. And they've been doing this based in this field for, 2.5 decades. So, like I said, feel free to share your opinion. Feel free if you feel like something was misaddressed, if you feel like something wasn't represented that you thought should have been. Make sure you include all of that. Feel free to debate it. Totally up to you. I thank you for listening again, and until next time, I'm Aaron Lockhart. We'll see you later.